Welcome. In this video, we explore the economics of specialization and gains from trade. Once again, our video features Jake, the unfortunate sailor who ends up stranded on a desert island. And it also features George, another unfortunate sailor stranded on the same desert island. We'll see that as Jake and George both fight to survive on this desert island, that they both are made better off if they specialize in the production of just one good and trade with the other one. Once again, Jake can spend his time either spearing fish or picking pineapple. If he spends a day spearing fish, he can spear 3 fish in a day. If Jake spends his day picking pineapple, he can pick 6 pineapples in one day. George can pick 10 pineapples in one day. So in the same amount of time as Jake spends picking 6 pineapples, George can pick 10 pineapples. Or he can spend a day spearing fish, in which case he can spear 4 fish. This table shows their weekly production possibilities, or how much they can produce if they focus on producing just one good. So if Jake, for instance, spends a 5-day week just fishing at 3 fish a day in the course of a 5-day week, he will be able to catch 15 fish. Or if he spends his week picking pineapples at 6 pineapples a day for a 5-day week, he can pick 30 pineapples. George, on the other hand, recall that he can catch 4 fish in a day. So in a 5-day week, he would be able to catch 20 fish. Or in one day, he can pick 10 pineapples. So in the course of 1 week, he'd be able to pick 50 pineapples. What is Jake's opportunity cost of a fish? Well, if he's fishing, he's giving up the opportunity to pick pineapples. And in the course of 1 week, he can pick 30 pineapples. So in the numerator, we put the number of pineapples he gives up. What is he getting? He's getting 15 fish. Gives up 30 pineapples for those 15 fish. And so that's 2 pineapples per fish. What is Jake's opportunity cost of a pineapple? Well, to pick pineapple, he gives up the opportunity to catch 15 fish. So he gives up 15 fish for 30 pineapples. That's 1/2 fish per pineapple. And so Jake's opportunity cost for fish is 2 pineapple per fish, or his opportunity cost for pineapple is 1/2 fish per pineapple. George, what is George's opportunity cost of a fish? Well, he gives up 50 pineapples to spear 20 fish in the course of a week, so he's given up 2.5 pineapple for every fish. What is George's opportunity cost of a pineapple? Well, he gives up 20 fish in the course of a week to pick 50 pineapples, so that's 2/5 fish per pineapple. So in our table down at the bottom, we have for both Jake and George their opportunity cost of both fish and pineapple. In order to explore whether it makes sense for them to specialize and trade, it makes sense to first discuss the concept of absolute advantage. An individual firm or country has an absolute advantage in producing a good or service if it can produce it using less resources than its competitors. And so, for instance, if one of them can, given a certain amount of time, catch more fish than the other, then that individual has an absolute advantage in fishing. Or if one of them, in a certain amount of time, in the same amount of time, can pick more pineapples than the other, then that individual has an absolute advantage in picking pineapple. Let's use our information in the weekly production possibilities table to figure out who has an absolute advantage in both fishing and in picking pineapple. Who has an absolute advantage in fish? Well, who in a given week can catch more fish? That's right, George can. And so it takes George less time to catch a fish than it takes Jake, who has an absolute advantage in pineapples. That's right, George does. It takes him less time to pick a pineapple. Or in a week, he can pick more pineapples than Jake can in the same amount of time. So here's the question. We know that George has an absolute advantage in both goods. Would it be good for George to specialize in the production of just one good and trade with Jake, where George is better at Jake at producing both fish and pineapples? Can George possibly benefit from trade with Jake? Well, it turns out he can, and that's because of the concept of comparative advantage. Absolute advantage isn't what drives trade and specialization. In determining which good Jake should focus on producing and which good George should focus on producing, it's not as much about absolute advantage as it is about comparative advantage. Comparative advantage, an individual, firm, or country has a comparative advantage in producing a good or service if it can produce it at a lower opportunity cost. And so to figure out who has a comparative advantage in producing fish, we need to figure out who has the lowest opportunity cost of producing fish. And so we've already calculated opportunity cost. So we have what we need to figure out who has a comparative advantage in fish and who has a comparative advantage in pineapples. Who has a comparative advantage in fish? That's right, Jake does. If we look at the opportunity cost in fish, Jake gives up 2 pineapples for each fish, but George has to give up 2.5 pineapples for each fish. And so it's actually, in a sense, less expensive for Jake to produce fish. Who has a comparative advantage in pineapples? That's right, George does. George gives up less fish to pick pineapples than Jake. According to the theory of comparative advantage, Jake should produce fish and trade for pineapples. That's because Jake has a comparative advantage in producing fish. George should produce pineapples and trade for fish. That's because George has a comparative advantage in pineapples. Both Jake and George can be made better off through trade if each of them focuses on producing the good in which he has the comparative advantage and then trades with the other for the good that he does not have a comparative advantage in. Then both of them can be made better off. Let's see how that works. First of all, let's look at the situation in which they don't trade, but they just work by themselves. Suppose each spends 2 days a week fishing and 3 days a week picking pineapples. Okay, so each of them are going to work by themselves, and each of them is going to spend 2 days a week fishing and then 3 days a week picking pineapple, so that they're able to meet all of their individual needs. And so if Jake spends 2 days a week fishing, Jake would be able to catch 6 fish in a week. If he spends 3 days a week picking pineapples, Jake would pick 18 pineapples in a week. George, if he spends 2 days a week fishing, he can catch 8 fish in a week. If he spends 3 days a week picking pineapples, in that amount of time, George would pick 30 pineapples. And so here's their weekly production without specialization in trade, if they're just working by themselves. Between the two of them, they have 14 fish and 48 pineapple. Now let's suppose that each of them now specialize according to the principle of comparative advantage and then trade. This means that each of them is going to produce only the good for which he has a comparative advantage. Jake would spend all 5 days producing 15 fish because he has a comparative advantage in producing fish, and he's not going to spend any time at all picking pineapple. George would spend all 5 days producing 50 pineapples. And he's not going to spend any time fishing because that's not where his comparative advantage lies. And so we see, if we compare their weekly production without specialization and trade with their weekly production with specialization and trade, you see that between the two of them, they have more fish and more pineapple. And so it's possible for each of them now to trade, where Jake will trade fish for pineapple and George will trade pineapple for fish. It's possible for them both to trade in such a way that they're made better off. And again, that's because the total amount of fish and the total amount of pineapple between the two of them is greater.